Hello everybody and welcome to the first lesson in our series on an introduction to metaphysics. In this lesson what we're going to do is ask the question, what is metaphysics? And then we're going to talk about the scope of this series of lessons in the future before talking about the future of metaphysics on this channel, essentially. So, as an introduction, if we look here, we are going to be doing this as an introduction to the study of metaphysics, hence the name of this series. And this is supposed to complement all of the other introductory series of philosophy that we're going to be doing. We have a general introduction to philosophy series, which will focus on the ideas of logic and argumentation within philosophy. We're going to do an introduction to metaphysics, an introduction to ethics, an introduction to epistemology, and an introduction to political philosophy. Now, like I said, we're going to try and look towards getting a working definition of metaphysics, examine the importance and beauty of the subject of metaphysics, why it's one of my favourite subjects personally, and why I always, when I was an undergraduate at university studying philosophy, I always was attracted to the metaphysics and advanced metaphysics topics. And then we're going to look at the scope of this introductory series to examine exactly what we're going to be looking at in the kind of detail that we're going to be looking at it in. Now, I'll just put right now as a disclaimer that this is an introductory course on the subject of metaphysics. The aim is to be broad in terms of subject matter, but then a little bit more lax in terms of specific detail. So this series is going to be about 8 lessons long, and we're going to spend 1 lesson on each of the major topics within metaphysics, which means that we're not going to be able to go into the kind of in-depth analysis that you might expect from a metaphysics course, but the reason for that is because, of course, we're going to do a more advanced series of lessons in the future that go into far more detail and have far more lessons attached to them. So, let's think about this question then. What is metaphysics? What do we mean when we are studying metaphysics? Well, just like with the definition of philosophy, metaphysics is also a subject which is notoriously difficult to define adequately. There are some areas which tend to be quite metaphysical in terms of their subject, but you might not describe as metaphysics. And then there are some areas which are not particularly metaphysical, which you might study in metaphysics. These are all different ideas that mean that essentially a working and an adequate definition of what metaphysics actually is can be difficult to accurately delimit. Now, most dictionaries or encyclopedias will suggest that metaphysics is essentially the philosophical study of the fundamental building blocks of reality. That is quite a nice way of defining it. I quite like that because it is broad enough in the sense that it means that we can encompass all of the topics within metaphysics. We can study the philosophy of time and the philosophy of modality in the same sense because they are both talking about fundamental building blocks of reality. Ultimately, as well, metaphysics looks to take an examination of some of the most abstract and most difficult questions and try and provide some answers to them. Now, one of the things that we are going to talk about in future lessons is looking at the various different critiques of metaphysics, because in some cases, metaphysics can be said to be so broad and so unfalsifiable in some ways as to the ability to even come to a definite right or wrong answer to some of the questions, that it begs the question whether or not metaphysics is even worth doing in the first place. And so that is going to be a series of lessons in and of itself, but it should be worth noting that that's one of the things that's quite interesting about the subject of metaphysics, that it is so broad in some senses that even some individuals within the academic world of philosophy critique the subject itself. Another way of defining metaphysics is to suggest it is the study of being, becoming, and reality itself. Being, the nature of being and existence, what it means to change and persist in reality, and then the reality in which existence can be defined. That's another way in which some people have thought about trying to define what metaphysics may be. According to Hall from 2012, however, metaphysics looks to answer 2 questions in both the abstract and the fully comprehensive manner. Metaphysics firstly asks the question of what it is that exists, what actually exists in reality, and then what that thing is like. What it is like to exist and what it is like for that thing to exist. Those are two ways in which we can define metaphysical questions as well. Now, if we look at the etymology of the phrase, just like what we did when we looked at the etymology of philosophy, we talked about what philosophy is, how some people have defined what a philosopher is and what it means to study philosophy, but then we also looked at the etymology of the phrase itself, philosophy of course deriving out of the ancient Greek love of wisdom. What do we mean when we look at the etymology of the phrase or the word metaphysics? Well, again, it derives from the Greek. Meta often refers to above or after, and physics refers to the study of physics. And this has led some to believe that you study metaphysics as almost the natural, logical consequence of studying physics. And the term may have first been coined by Aristotle, essentially the idea being that you study physics, you study the science of physics, and once you've fully comprehended the study of physics, you then study what comes after physics, i.e. metaphysics, some of the more abstract questions that pertain to reality and existence. Now, one of the reasons for this is because in the ancient Greek period of philosophy, there was not that much specific delineation between what is science and what was philosophy. Many of the philosophers were also natural scientists, also came up with a number of different inventions and different scientific discoveries. And so as a result, philosophy and physics sort of melded together as a sort of one all-encompassing subject. But it implies that metaphysics is somehow superior to physics, or is somehow something that you have to master physics for first in order to understand metaphysics. You don't have to have a prerequisite understanding of physics in order to understand what metaphysics is. That is just not true. Because whereas physics studies the mechanical workings and the mechanical understandings of how things work, metaphysics asks some of the more fundamental and philosophical questions about those subjects. So, for example, you will study time if you did a physics degree. You will study what time is, how time operates, how time relates to space, things like general relativity and special relativity, the influence of and the dilation of time in relation to speed or in relation to bends in space-time as a result of gravity, etc., etc., etc. But when you study time in metaphysics, you don't ask those questions. You ask the question, okay, well, what is time? What does time flow? Is time real? Is the past real? Is the present real? How does time flow? These are all these kinds of questions that are metaphysical in nature. So given all these pieces of information, like I said, the point of this series is to provide you with an introductory overview of some of the most basic and fundamental questions within metaphysics itself. And so what we're going to do is talk about each of the major topics within metaphysics in their own separate lessons, and then this will essentially provide the precursor to a more advanced series of lessons in the future. We're going to begin by talking about ontology and existence, what the philosophy of ontology actually means, what does it mean to exist, what is a thing, essentially, is the answer to that question. We'll talk about the idea of identity within metaphysics. We'll talk about space and time. We're going to talk about the philosophy of causation, a thing being caused by something else. We'll then talk about the metaphysics of cosmology and physics and the universe, before finishing on some of the more subsidiary issues. Do we have free will? What does it mean to have free will? Could we subscribe to a fatalistic universe or a deterministic universe? And then finally, we'll ask questions about the philosophy of mathematics, the metaphysics of mathematics. Is maths invented or discovered? What are numbers? Are numbers real? What are kinds of ways in which we can essentially subscribe to a coherent metaphysical understanding of mathematics? These are all the questions that we're going to ask in this series of lessons.